Uh, Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Gordon Gray. I'm the Kuwait Professor of Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Affairs here at the Elliott School, and I'm also have the good fortune to direct the Middle East Policy Forum. And I want to thank all of you for being here, and also all of our those in our audience who are tuning in online. I also want to thank, as always, Christian Clinton, who does all the hard work to make these events run, and the ExxonMobil Corporation, who kindly gives financial support to the Middle East Policy Forum, and of course, most importantly, to our two guests, who I'll introduce in just a minute. I also want to highlight that the Leadership, Ethics, and Practice Initiative here at the Elliott School is co-sponsoring this event. The director of that program, Professor Kojum, used to be a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. And so I think it's particularly important to highlight that they're co-sponsoring this, because the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department has a well-deserved reputation, not just for getting it right, but also for being willing to dissent within the intelligence community on some of the assessments. I'd also like to invite all of you, be you here in person or online, to our next Middle East Policy Forum event, which is 4 weeks from today, when we're going to have two experts talk about the Middle East policy of the next administration. They know a lot about the Middle East, but spoiler alert, they don't know who's going to win the election. So we'll just have to wait and see. And those will be Farah Pandith from Council on Foreign Relations, and Andrew Miller, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs, with particular responsibility for this area of the world that we're talking about. So anyway, try and mark, it'll be 1:30 next in 4 weeks. And to get to the subject at hand, public servants have no greater responsibility than, in my opinion, than speaking truth to power, and that's what our two panelists did. To your right is Ambassador William Roebuck, who retired from the Foreign Service just about 4 years ago, right, Bill? After a 28-year diplomatic career, he's currently the Executive Vice President at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. We're former, I have full disclosure, we're former colleagues, longtime friends. And in his final assignment in the Foreign Service, Ambassador Roebuck was the Deputy Special Envoy for the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. One of the things I learned in Washington was the longer the title, probably the less responsibility you have. But that's still is Ambassador Roebuck's the one who disproves that adage, because he was often the only U.S. diplomat on the ground in northern Syria, and he deservedly received a Distinguished Honor Award for this work, which is the highest State Department award. If it's not, it should be. I just had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Annelle Sheline today. She's a research fellow in the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute, and previously served as a foreign area officer foreign affairs officer, at the Department of State in the Human Rights Bureau's Near East office. She resigned in March because of the unconditional support that the Biden administration has been giving to the Israeli military operations in Gaza. Even though we just met, Annelle knows GW probably better than I do, since she got her PhD in political science here a few years back. There's a saying often attributed to Thomas Jefferson. Dissent is the highest form of patriotism. There's actually no evidence that he said it, but it doesn't matter who said it. I think it's a really important adage to keep in mind as we have the discussion today, because I think it's just as true today as it was in 1776 or whatever year he didn't say it. So with all that, thanks to both of our guests for being here. And Bill, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. Thank you, Gordon. Delighted to be here today at Elliott School to talk with you about dissent in the State Department and maybe a little more broadly the subject of dissent as Gordon sort of opened that aperture up a little bit. There's a broad sense, I think, that dissent is a foundational thread in U.S. History and the development of the United States as a country. Go back, I won't go into it in any detail, but if you go back and look at a little bit of the history of dissent in our country, you'll find that the very origins of the migration populations that came over here had a dissenting aspect to their thinking and to their beliefs. The people who were instrumental in the passage of the First Amendment in the constitutional debate, there were some of the supporters, key supporters for that Bill of Rights and the amendment were religious dissenters. Very strong tradition of, a lot of it was religious dissent, but it was part of the dissenting tradition in the United States, and it's a very important tradition. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with dissent. This occurred near the end of my career. I was at the time a senior Foreign Service officer. I was posted to northeastern Syria. At that time, we did not have diplomatic relations with Syria. The embassy had been closed for several years, so I did not have diplomatic status. I was in Syria in a remote part of the northeast, working with a local partner force, predominantly Kurdish force, a Kurdish Arab force that was helping us to fight ISIS. And I was embedded with U.S. Special Forces. No embassy, of course, in case I was hundreds of miles from Damascus, where our embassy was located. My primary function at that time was to try to maintain and strengthen the relationship between the United States government and the military and the leadership of our partner force. We were working with the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces. So I met almost daily with General Mazloum Kobani, who was the head of the SDF, and that was commanders, and focused heavily on communicating to Washington what his priorities, his needs were, what his thinking was, and on the flip side, communicating to him what Washington was thinking about the war against ISIS in Syria. I also got out and about in northeastern Syria, traveled a lot all around that area of the country. We were trying to help rebuild northeastern Syria, these communities that had been destroyed in the course of the occupation and then the fight against ISIS. So I was checking on local councils, whether they were the village or the town or city level. And then the last part of the sort of general focus I was involved in was meeting with Arab tribal leaders because the Arabs were an important component of the Syrian Democratic Forces. The command and control spine, the real officer corps, was primarily Kurdish, but there was a very important Arab component in the fighting forces. And there were frictions, sometimes Kurdish Arab frictions. So I had a role trying to iron out those frictions and keep the Arab leaders on side, so to speak. So that's a little bit on the nutshell background of what I was doing out in Syria. I reported back to an office in Washington, the office for the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS, a piece of the State Department. And I worked for Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, who was the head of the office, and he was also the Secretary of State's Special Representative for Syria. Just a little bit of background on what happened to prompt my dissent. In October of 2019, I had been in Syria for about a year. At that time, Turkey, which bordered Syria to the north, decided to invade northeastern Syria, where we were located. The U.S. Special Forces, there were about 1,000 troops scattered all over the northeast, working with the SDF. The fighting broke out between Turkey and the Kurdish forces that we were working with. It was difficult fighting, and it extended for several weeks. Around mid-October, so this was early October that the fighting started with the invasion. Around mid-October, then Vice President Pence was dispatched to negotiate a ceasefire, and the Turks, as a part of that agreement, got a buffer zone in northeastern Syria that extended about 20 miles down from the border and about 70 miles across. Quite a big buffer zone. They wanted more, but in the end, that's what they got. That was in mid-October. And then at the end of October, because I was deeply unhappy with the way things had developed, I sent in a dissent memo. It was an informal memo. I had been moved from the makeshift base I was long serving at to something that was much more remote and provisional. I didn't have secure communications, so I was not in a position to send what we call a formal dissent channel cable or dissent channel message. But I was using, at that point, I was communicating to the department with an iPhone. And so I sent in this message. I drafted it, sent it in via iPhone, so it was unclassified. About a week after I sent it in, this would have been in about the end of the first week of November, it leaked to the New York Times. I didn't leak it, but somebody that received it leaked, or who saw it leaked it. It went to Ambassador Jeffrey and about 24 people that normally worked with me on the Defeat ISIS mission. So it's fairly wide distribution. Somebody leaked it and it was basically covered all over the national media. I did not comment on it to the media. I did not resign my position. I continued to work in northeastern Syria and finished out my assignment there until the following summer. I think my boss, Ambassador Jeffrey, probably was irritated for a day or so about the message, but I think he generally took it to be an instance of internal dissent or loyal dissent. I like to think that he found it useful in his own way. He was a very seasoned diplomat, had a long experience in dealing with the Turkish government. So that was my hope. What did it accomplish or did it not accomplish? My memo, I think obviously it did not have an impact on the Turkish invasion that started. It continued. They occupied this zone. My memo did not roll that back. They were able to use diplomacy and military operations, and all of that continued. I think where it did have some impact, I mentioned 3 areas where perhaps it had some impact. I think it helped the United States pretty quickly to repair its relations with the Kurds. The Kurds, when this invasion from Turkey occurred, the Kurds were very angry at us, and they felt they had been abandoned and betrayed by the United States. They had worked closely with us. They had absorbed 10,000 or so casualties, fatalities in the fight against ISIS. They had done a lot for us, and they felt like we had not stood by them. So the memo, I think, helped convey to them that there were voices in the U.S. government that appreciated what they were doing and that did not agree with the way the United States had handled this action by Turkey. I think secondly, it also helped ensure that Turkey would bear the diplomatic and reputational costs for what was happening in this zone in northeastern Syria, including reputational costs for human rights abuses and for atrocities that were being committed by troops, either Turkish troops or Syrian Arab troops under their Turkish command. And then I think the final thing it accomplished is it put down a marker at a very pivotal time for the Kurdish population that remained in this area, put down a marker for the international community, for the international media, and particularly for the Turks, that they were under scrutiny and that the United States, the international community, was looking very closely at what was going to happen there with the Kurdish communities that remained. President Erdogan had already talked at his UN General Assembly speech a month and a half before the invasion about Turkey's strategic plans for this area, that they wanted to depopulate it and that they wanted to repopulate it with Syrian refugees in Turkey. So there was a lot of concern about what would happen. There was some ethnic cleansing that went on. I like to think that the memo I wrote had some impact in limiting how much ethnic cleansing occurred. Let me close by just talking a little bit about a couple of the reasons why I dissented. First, I felt that we could have stopped Turkey's military action to stop it from happening. We could have prevented it if we had spoken out more forcefully and more consistently at the highest levels of the US government. I think President Trump was frankly very erratic and inconsistent in the way he spoke with President Erdogan. From what I've seen of the public record of those conversations, I think he was not committed to the presence of US troops in the region. And I think that relatively weak position at the White House filtered down to the State Department and also had an impact there. And I think it empowered the Turkish side of the perspective in the State Department when I think it could have empowered a more pro-SDF Kurdish Arab side of it. I also spoke out because I was outraged by some of the atrocities that were committed in the area where the Turks invaded. I felt that the United States government should have condemned those abuses much more forcefully than they did. And finally, I felt like we just owed the Kurds in particular more support. I felt like we put a target on their backs with our actions in arming them and in getting them to fight with us against ISIS. Before we did that, Turkey did not view those small military forces or those Kurdish political leaders as an existential threat on their border. After we armed the Kurds and got them to fight with us against ISIS, Turkey did view them that way. So I felt like we put a target on their back in a way that I think put more responsibility on us to provide more support for them. And then the final thing I'd say, often with dissent, there's a triggering event, something in particular that just is the last straw. And for me, it was a killing of a Kurdish politician who was shot and killed. Hevrin Khalaf, who I had worked with, knew, and I worked with her and her co-founder on founding a political party in northeastern Syria. This was a party the State Department had talked about publicly, had very positively sort of celebrated it. And I and others had worked with the Kurds to help shape this party. In any case, I and others were outraged and didn't think that the US government has spoken out forcefully enough. So all of those are sort of the reasons why I dissented, and that gives you maybe a sense of where I thought there was some impact and where that impact stopped. Gordon, I'll turn it back over to you. I'm happy to answer any questions later.
Well, first, it's such an honor to get to be here back at GW as Ambassador Gray mentioned, I did my PhD here, but my dissertation advisor, Nathan Brown, is here. It's such an honor to get to be back at GW. I also want to highlight the distinction between myself and Ambassador Roebuck, who had a very long and distinguished career at the State Department. I was only at State for a single year before resigning. I resigned in March of this year over the unconditional US support for Israel's actions in Gaza. Similarly, I'll just provide a little bit of background kind of about me and what I was doing at the State Department, and then we'll want to leave time for questions. So I was with the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, or DRL, with their Near East Affairs Office, so DRL NEA. So this is the office of the State Department that produces the human rights reports every year, and I was working on Near East Affairs. And I was not covering Israel-Palestine. I was mostly covering countries in North Africa, and part of the time I was there was looking at Gulf countries. And I joined the State Department because I had a Boren Fellowship, which some of you may be aware of if you're here doing graduate studies. So I had studied Arabic in Egypt years ago, back when I had started my PhD, and so I owed the government a year of service. And DRL NEA actually reached out to me and said, hey, we see you've got this outstanding service requirement. And you've got a PhD and you know the region, we would like, you have sort of non-competitive hiring status. So they were able to bring me in. And this is just, you know, for those of you who are maybe thinking about government, it is difficult to get government jobs, either to become a foreign service officer, it's a difficult process, or to get, I was on the civil service side. These are challenging jobs to get. They're very competitive. And so, you know, for me, I had this academic background. I had a PhD in political science. I was working at a think tank called the Quincy Institute, working on Middle East, US foreign policy towards the Middle East. And so saw this as an opportunity to fulfill my service requirement. I had also just had a baby. You know, there were a lot of factors going on in my life, but decided that yes, it would be a great opportunity to get to see what was it like on the inside, and especially to get to work on human rights. I'm someone who was already somewhat skeptical of US foreign policy towards the Middle East. The Quincy Institute is an anti-militarism think tank. It opposes unnecessary use of US military force around the world. So I didn't have a lot of illusions going into it, but I did think that working on human rights would be an area that I would be interested in, that I would find compelling, especially the chance to get to work with civil society organizations, you know, to get to travel to the region. It seemed like an excellent opportunity. So I had been at the State Department only about 6 months when October 7th happened. And it became clear almost immediately what the US response was going to be, the level of support that the US was going to provide. People may remember that right at the beginning, President Biden warned Israel not to react the way the US did after 9/11 with these extreme levels of violence and civilian casualties. But unfortunately, despite that warning, it was clear that the US was going to provide you know, what we now know has been really absolutely unconditional and illegal support. The amount and the extent of the US support for Israel violates US laws, but we'll get to that in a minute. But so from the beginning, this was clear internally. You saw people like Josh Paul, for example, who was the first person to resign publicly over this policy. And he resigned on October 18th, so almost exactly a year ago. And that happened to correspond with the day that Biden flew to Israel and embraced Netanyahu and, you know, pledged US support for Israel in this difficult time in the aftermath of the Hamas attack. And so that sort of embodies the bear hug policy that the US was pursuing as far as providing this sort of overwhelming support. And the idea was to, or at least the way it was framed, was to influence Israeli policy and hopefully to try to mitigate civilian casualties was the framing. And I remember internally, myself and others, especially working on human rights, but not just working on human rights, were really impressed by what Josh Paul had done. He was the director of an office, so sort of like 2 levels up the hierarchy from me. I was just kind of working level foreign affairs officer. And at the same time, you know, I sort of thought to myself, well, but I'm here. We have the dissent channel. You know, if it gets to a point where it seems, you know, that dissent is necessary, there are channels here. There are mechanisms, and you know, I can have a bigger impact here on the inside than you know, like, not to judge what Josh Paul did, but you know, I'm going to try and stay. And over time, it just became clear that there was immense internal dissent. As Ambassador Roebuck mentioned, when he submitted his dissent memo, that was different because the internal dissent channel, or you know, a dissent cable is submitted through the classified system. It is just a little bit about that system. It was set up in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, where you did have this was not the only reaction to the Vietnam War. That was also where Congress required the human rights reports, for example. You saw in the aftermath of Vietnam and Nixon an effort by the American public and members of Congress to try to rein in the imperial presidency and the ways that the US government was violating our own alleged values around human rights, for example. And so it was in that context that you saw the State Department set up things like the dissent channel, within which people can submit their dissent. Like I mentioned, the human rights reports and other ways within which the US government, especially under the Carter administration, was trying to get US policy to line up with some of these stated values. And it was in that context that the bureau that I was working for was established, the Human Rights Bureau. In just before this event, we got to have lunch with a few students, and one student mentioned that in her role in government, they don't have a dissent channel. And I've heard that echoed by other people, that, you know, others who are opposed to the Gaza policy wish that they had a dissent channel the way the State Department does. And I would actually say that in my experience, I found the dissent channel to be more of a pressure release valve, which is something that we know authoritarian governments do to try to release some public pressure, you know, allow people to express themselves a little bit, but without actually changing anything fundamentally. I co-authored a dissent cable that was specifically focused on the human rights issues. I signed 2 other dissent cables. I think the reason the dissent channel is not more effective as a means of maybe trying to shift policy is because there is so little transparency. You have no idea how many dissent cables there have been. There is very much a concern about leaks. People may remember it in early November, there was a dissent cable that was leaked, and the authors of that cable, I believe, kept their jobs. I know I'm in touch with one of them who's still in her job, but it got very dicey for her for a little while. And the message after that was very much, you know, from our superiors, like, this is inappropriate, you are not to speak to journalists, you are not to leak these kinds of things. There was increasingly, I think, a sense of some paranoia inside the State Department as the death toll was growing in Gaza, as it was becoming clear what Israel was doing and what Israel's intentions were towards that civilian population. So in my case, it became clear over time that being on the inside was not having any kind of an impact, at least not at the very low level where I was sitting. And I decided that I was going to fulfill my service requirement, and then I was going to resign. And I let this be known internally, but I was not planning to go public because I had only been there a year. Like, who cares? I'm just some very junior person. But it was in conversation with colleagues at State who said, please consider going public. It seems that public pressure is the only thing that is having any impact at all. So I decided, okay, I'll go public and, maybe it'll get some attention. And it got more attention than I expected. And, I think some closing thoughts here before turning to questions. There has been this question, people have asked me of, do you think you made the right call by leaving? Now you're on the outside and you can criticize, but, think about what you might have been able to do if you'd stayed, especially becoming more senior, being in more of a decision-making role. And I do think this is a question for many of my colleagues who are opposed to this policy and who have chosen to stay, that they hope that by staying on the inside, they can have an impact. If not now, then there will be future crises and future conflicts. And this also came up in our conversation that I do think it is really a personal question. It just comes down to, what do you feel you are willing and able to do? I think for me, it had just gotten to a point where I just didn't want to walk in the door anymore. I just didn't want to feel that I was complicit, by continuing to participate in this. I was sort of signaling my consent to what was going on. One final note, I think, in particular having to do with human rights advocacy, I do think that, just to use my soapbox for a minute more, I am very alarmed at the effect that US policy has had on America's standing in the world. I saw this play out in trying to advocate for human rights. I think that we as Americans, those of us in the room who are Americans or who are just sitting here in Washington, I don't think we necessarily have a great understanding of the damage that these policies have done to US standing in the world. And I think that by frittering away America's influence and our moral standing, that we will come to regret this as far as future crises that will require greater cooperation, whether it's especially on things like climate change, for example, but so many of the coming global problems will require partnership with other countries. And I really consider it extremely regrettable that this administration has pursued a policy that has squandered so much of America's influence abroad.
Well, thanks to both of you, both for your comments, which I certainly found very interesting, and I'm sure everyone in the audience did, and also for your intellectual integrity, which sometimes might be lacking inside this town. I'm going to turn it right over to the audience. I'm sure you've got lots of questions. These are tough issues, and people questions probably better than anyone else. So.
Service, so very.
You speak up, please.
So first of all, thank you for speaking with us today. But my question is actually for you, because there's a lot of discourse now on international law. I just wonder, like, leading up to the time that you're resigning and among your colleagues at State now, what are conversations on that topic like in terms of, the US being this world power who speaks of a rules-based system and international order, and yet when it comes to international law, we're not exactly following everything the way we should.
Totally. I think that's an excellent question. The question for Zoom was about international law and what the conversation has been at State about that. So, the United States is interesting because, you know, our country played a very robust role in setting up the sort of international system that came out of World War II. And yet we've been very hesitant to actually sign on to a lot of international treaties or, you know, there's been a lot of sort of subsequent evolution of international law that the US has felt unwilling to necessarily participate in. That being said, the US is a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, which are very clear, which the US and Israel are violating. We're also violating our own laws. So, for example, Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act stipulates that a country that is blocking US humanitarian aid is no longer eligible to receive any kind of security assistance. Full stop, we're violating that. We're violating the Ley Laws. This is something that has been reported on publicly where there were Leahy designations sitting on Secretary Blinken's desk for months that he ignored. And then when ProPublica did report on them, the decision was made that Israel would essentially just get to investigate itself. And the determination that sort of community service was going to be adequate punishment for an Israeli soldier who was involved in the death of not only an unarmed Palestinian, but an individual who also had American citizenship. We're violating so many laws. There are more laws, but it's so on the one hand, I do think it is. This gets to my point about how we're undermining America's role in the world and our credibility on upholding the so-called rules-based international order, the hypocrisy of which is even more stark given the efforts to galvanize a coalition to support Ukraine, the framing of that being sort of the need to defend, democracy and the rules-based international order and the UN Charter against aggression, et cetera. But I would charge that really it's the violation of our own laws, which should concern those of us who are perhaps not as perturbed by the fact that, the US doesn't like to be constrained by international law necessarily.
Another question?
Hi, so I was curious if either of you are aware of any of our allies, for example, or any parallel dissent channels that might be more transparent or more effective in other countries and how the US might be able to learn from those channels? Thank you.
It's a good question. I am not, because I haven't sort of focused much attention on it. I don't know, Gordon, you might know as well as I do, but I don't know of other countries with diplomatically established dissent channels. They may exist, but I'm not aware of it.
I know I was in conversation with a French diplomat who said, we're thinking about maybe doing this. But so I know France doesn't have one. I do think that sort of inside state there, as Ambassador Roebuck mentioned, sort of his intention was not to sort of go public with his dissent memo. He simply wanted it to be made known internally. And that is very much in keeping with the culture of the State Department of this is, you keep it inside. It is wholly inappropriate to sort of go public or talk to journalists. That is often seen as counterproductive. And so I think it's sort of within that framework that the dissent channel was established. And I mean, just although there is not much transparency, my understanding is that the war in Gaza has generated more dissent cables than any other policy. But again, other than those who are in charge of receiving them, it's hard to really get a sense of how many there've actually been.
I'll give just 2 points of information, which won't completely answer your question because I don't know if other foreign services have them or not, but you mentioned the French are thinking about it. I was in happened to be in Tunisia at the time of the revolution, and which many people don't remember, many Americans don't remember, was right after the WikiLeaks cable were released. Some of the cables that were released were from Embassy Tunis, illuminating how corrupt the Ben Ali regime was. And the mid-level officers at the French embassy were kind of outraged is too strong a word, but ticked off because they said, we report about those things as well. It's not just the Americans, but as far as I know, no dissent channel. But since we're on the topic of the dissent channel, just one observation, which is it's only as effective as the people at the very top are willing to listen to contrary views. It's, I think, unlikely to change policy. I don't know if it has or hasn't in the past, but I'll give you an example, a specific example of where I think it was entirely appropriately used, even though the policy didn't change right away, which was over 20 years ago when many of my colleagues working on the former Yugoslavia were upset by the, or outraged really by the lack of US protection for the Bosnians and the seemingly, I'll use a diplomatic word, tepid US policy. They authored a dissent memo, and to his great credit, Secretary Christopher met with them, and they had a long discussion of it, and none of them suffered repercussions in their career. He heard them out. He didn't change his policy, but as the histories of our involvement in Bosnia are written, they were on that famous right side of history, and the policy eventually did change in the direction that they were advocating. But I think they would be the first to admit, not directly because of their dissent in the instance. I don't know, Chris, do you want to add anything? Any other questions? Good, here, and then we'll go to you.
As far as it goes to why Israel is getting unconditional support from the US, I've heard claims of the Israeli lobby being a large reason. Is that true at all? Or how true is that? A lot of it, because to my understanding, it would be illegal if Israel were directly lobbying the US. I'm not 100% sure if that's true or not, but that's my understanding of it.
I mean, I think it's clear that there's a lot of US domestic political support for Israel in this country. Some of it is historical, it goes back a long time. There's been support for the establishment of Israel, and in the American Jewish communities have been quite strong. But there are also strands of thinking of political development in the states more broadly than that have been strongly supportive of Israel historically. And there are pools of support in the evangelical Christian community for the support of Israel, which is also important in as a further sort of spring of support in politics for the state of Israel and what it does. Yeah, so it's a broad-based sense of support for Israel, and I think you saw evidence of it in the way Israel was able to weather the criticisms in the United States and elsewhere, and sort of continue, and it still continues to pursue the policies that it has put in place over the last year. It hasn't been forced to walk back those policies. So clearly, there's a lot of support in the United States for Israel and for making sure that it has freedom of movement and that it doesn't bear consequences from the United States or internationally for the actions that it takes.
So I would absolutely attribute a lot of the unconditional support to the Israel lobby. I think we've seen that evidenced by their efforts, for example, to successfully oust two sitting members of Congress by primarying them, Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush. Interestingly, they did not frame that as these individuals are insufficiently pro-Israel because that's not really a winning message. They try to frame it as, they went after them on other grounds. But they have, I would posit that the ways that the Israel lobby was historically able to operate and assume sort of bipartisan, unquestioned support are being significantly eroded. We did see this with the criticism from Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush, as well as people like Rashida Tlaib, for example, or Barbara Lee, who AIPAC was not able to oust from their seats. Your question about would it be illegal? I mean, as Ambassador Roebuck mentioned, this is coming from domestic sources, although they are perhaps working very closely with individuals and organizations, the government of Israel, but it does have a domestic base of support. I think given that we are seeing in Washington more scrutiny of foreign funding, for example, Gulf money, funding think tanks, funding universities, money from China, from Taiwan, like foreign governments try to do what they can to make sure that their preferred outcomes are the policy in Washington. And so I do think that increasingly we are likely to see greater attention played to that. Things like the, FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act, under which foreign entities do have to register if they're involved in that kind of like lobbying. But, a lot of it does have to do with the political backbone to go after it. So I do think that increasingly, as we've seen kind of the bipartisan consensus break down, we are likely to see more scrutiny into the Israel lobby.
Good question.
Thank you both for coming. I wanted to ask about the letter that came out today from the Secretary of State that warned Israel it needs to increase aid to Gaza or it might lose access to US weapons. Dr. Sheline, you mentioned how when you were in the State Department, people were telling you that public pressure was like the only or the most effective tool right now in influencing policy. Would you say this letter has been a result of public pressure, or do you think any of it could be ascribed to internal pressure?
That's a great question, and I imagine there must have been some internal pressure. Just acknowledging the fact that is U.S. law, especially under 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act, again about blocking humanitarian aid. I interpreted that letter somewhat cynically. I do think that there is concern from the Democratic Party that they are losing key constituencies in swing states who, not only Arab and Muslim voters, but, the hundreds of thousands of people who voted uncommitted, swing state voters who say they disagree with this unconditional support for Israel. So I'm inclined to see the timing of that, especially sort of the somewhat arbitrary 30-day deadline, which is not part of the law, which would put us after the election. I'm not holding my breath for them to really take action on that.
Yeah.
I had a question for Mr. Roebuck. So when your dissent memo was leaked, you talked a little bit about how it got attention from the higher ups. So I was wondering if it affected or did it affect your relationship with your colleagues directly? And also you mentioned that that it was leaked, but you didn't specify who did it. Does the state go about trying to find out where these leaks come from, or does it not necessarily matter? It's just whichever, which State Department employee it came from. Where the link is.
Question. A couple points. With regard to reactions of colleagues, I had a lot of colleagues similar to what Annelle was talking about, who privately, sent me messages of support for what I had done for the memo, and the fact that it was out in the public domain, and they felt similarly like I did, that we had not stood by Kurds as strongly as we should have, given the contributions that they had made, and that we would have had more impact and we could have possibly stopped that Turkish military action. So I got a lot of private messages from colleagues and thanking me for the memo. I'll be honest with you about two things about the reaction. One is, I'm being a little bit not disingenuous, but let's just put it this way. I was relatively I was aware that the memo was very possibly going to be leaked, and that the real power of the memo was going to be in it becoming public. It's very true, I did not leak it. I didn't take measures to leak it, but it leaked, and it didn't surprise me that it leaked. It was an unclassified memo. I have been in other situations in the State Department where classified like memos leaked, and there are more repercussions because there are more hooks that the department has to go after people, for leaking anything that's got a classification on it. An unclassified memo is very difficult for the department to sort of, launch some sort of investigation about how could that possibly leak. It's a message on an iPhone, so there wasn't much they could do. But just circling back on, and I salute Annelle for what she did with the action she took in actually resigning and making it a public thing, because that is really where the power of dissent gets its most powerful voice. It's people take actions and it becomes public. And I share your frustration about dissent things just in a channel that don't get public. It somehow doesn't seem to have the impact, and it serves as maybe a justification channel for people in authority to feel good about what they're doing and not having a real force to make them change their actions.
Go online.
Ambassador, sort of as a follow-up question, could you share your thought process as to why, after you shared your dissent, you stayed in your position?
It's good, very good question. I felt like I was playing a really important role. The reason I had dissented was because I thought what the Kurds were doing with their Arab colleagues was critically important in helping us defeat ISIS. And I felt like I could be useful in rebuilding that relationship, and I wanted to stay and do it. I felt very committed to the Kurds, to the Kurdish leadership I've been working with, and I wanted to repair the relationship and get it focused again on what we had been doing together.
We have an online question?
Yes, this is an online question. This is for Dr. Sheline. How did you balance your skepticism towards the sort of token humanitarian movements that the administration has made with your career aspirations?
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, it's how do you balance the skepticism that you have towards the token humanitarian movements made by the administration with your career aspirations?
So I feel extremely lucky that I came out of the State Department and was able to go back to the think tank where I had previously worked. I was extremely fortunate to have that option, whereas I very much salute my colleagues people like Josh Paul, people like Hala Rarit, who was the Arabic language spokesperson, people like Stacy Gilbert, who served in the State Department for decades and resigned when they changed the outcome of the NSM 20, which she and colleagues had determined that Israel was blocking humanitarian aid. And then the State Department took that report away from them and then published it and saying that that was not the case, and she resigned. These are individuals for whom working in government is their entire professional network. And so I know that even just for myself, I felt chagrin at criticizing, I knew that my colleagues would feel to a certain extent that I had betrayed them, that I had betrayed their trust by going public, that I had perhaps betrayed the work that we were trying to do by emphasizing that, like, look, it is impossible to advocate for human rights under these circumstances. My colleagues who are still trying to do that work might say, hey, we still have to do this. Like, don't say that this doesn't matter, or that it's impossible, because we're still trying to do it and we still believe in it. So I did feel, I felt bad knowing that, colleagues who I respected would feel that I had betrayed their trust by doing this. But I think for me, it was very different. I had not spent my whole career there. I had other professional networks. I had colleagues at GW who reached out after to say, thank you so much for what you did. Whereas I do really, and others, here and elsewhere, people who extended their support. Whereas again, I think for those for whom that is, they are burning those professional bridges and they don't necessarily have another network of support. I really salute them. But as far as my professional prospects, I don't think the government's going to want to hire me anytime soon.
I have a question about maybe there's some lessons to learn from comparing the two cases of how much influence one can have depending where they are in the foreign policy process. The differences between the two cases seem to be between a somewhat novel set of circumstances where different policies might have played out in Syria and Turkey compared to a deep commitment in American foreign policy to Israel, such that being in the State Department might have always had limitations in that policy issue. Some background, I'm actually a former diplomat myself to the Australian government who worked almost entirely on an issue that I disagreed with, and eventually went to academia. And the lesson that I learned from that was that working in the Foreign Office of Australia was downstream in the policy process where cabinet had already made decisions. And so I wonder whether being back at the Quincy Institute, for instance, gives more of a sense of being upstream and the ability to shape big issues like Israel, whereas maybe other issues such as the one in Syria were more likely to be influenced within the State Department.
Let me just say a little something about the way the issue played out for me. I think you're right in your general observation. I mean, there is a very strong, I wouldn't call it a Turkey lobby, but there's a very strong group of policymakers and people in the U.S. government who strongly believe in the importance of the relationship between the United States and Turkey. And they work very hard to ensure that those interests are protected. And if they don't get a signal, a strong signal in a particular instance that they need to back off, they become quite strong about and aggressive about pursuing interests that are, I would call them pro-Turkey, but they would define them as pro-U.S. relations with Turkey. That's the reason they would do this. But I think there was room for influence on that. I think you're right. I think we misplayed that influence. I think if the White House, as I mentioned, if the White House and State Department leadership levels had been a little bit more aggressive and signaled more support for that enterprise that we were doing with the Kurds to fight ISIS, I think we could have pushed back against Turkey in that specific instance, while preserving the relationship. The point I always made with people is that I said, look, Turkey values its relationship with the United States very much, but it pursues its interests extremely aggressively and is willing to break some eggs with the United States to do that. I don't know why we as the United States weren't willing to do that with Turkey while we had to handle them with kid gloves and they weren't doing it with us. So a bit of a complicated answer. I think we could have had more influence if we had chosen to exercise it, much more so on this issue, this Turkey-Kurd issue, I think, than the Israel issue, where there really is just a juggernaut of influence in the other direction.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And to get back to this question of having an impact on the inside, I do think that people can have an impact on the inside, just maybe not on the question of US support for Israel. Or, and also, the US-Turkey relationship. I mean, I think for some of these issues that, especially something like Israel, which is so domestically, politically salient and has such a strong domestic constituency pushing for those outcomes. Whereas, something like my efforts to advocate on behalf of a particular political prisoner in North Africa, am I going to totally shift US policy towards that particular North African nation? No, but am I able, if I'm really tenacious about it, is it possible that maybe the US position there will come across a bit more strongly on look, you really need to let this person go versus let someone who's busy and doesn't have the time to put in the legwork to make sure that those points are in that final, talking points that the secretary is going to deliver with the foreign minister of North African country. So you can have an impact. I do think for some of these higher level issues, it just gets that much harder. Not that it's a higher level issue, but that something where there is just such a strong set of actors pushing for a particular outcome. But as the ambassador mentioned, I mean, this is not limited to Israel. There are many countries and other advocacy groups that have their, a huge one just being, the power of the defense industry and, the power of the military industrial complex and shareholders, pushing for more investment in the US security sector and the extent to which, the sort of revolving door of Pentagon officials then going to work for big corporations like Raytheon and Boeing. And I mean, that is, there's so much more money and influence wrapped up in that than there is in the Israel lobby.
I had a question for Dr. Sheline. So in your own experience with your
Speak up just a second.
yeah, in your own experience with resigning and your colleagues, have you seen the State Department's sort of positioning harden then, where they basically then get new employees that have the same sort of opinion of the state that wouldn't have a sort of dissenting opinion that just creates sort of a echo chamber? Or and if so, if that is the case, do you believe sort of the reaction of these resignations, maybe enforcing public opinion, do you feel that outweighs the reinforcing within the State Department if they were to get employees who think the same way?
That's a really good question. I think that if there were massive numbers of people that had resigned over this, and there are more who have resigned quietly than who have done so publicly. I think that then some of the bureaucracies, whether it's the State Department or the military, might feel that they needed to be more aware of who they were hiring. I think because it has been quite limited, I don't know that anyone is feeling like they need to revamp how people get hired for the State Department or, elsewhere. I mean, I know the military in particular is dealing with insufficient recruits, so I think they're probably just trying to get as many people as possible, especially if we do get dragged into war with Iran, which is looming. But so, no, I mean, I think in general, as I mentioned at the outset, it is difficult to work for the State Department or to get into these positions. And so I think that the process is already fairly like, whether it's you're needing, well, I guess the final point I want to make there is even if there are people inside the government who are dissenting or opposed to the policy, you're not able to advance inside the bureaucracy if you sort of make a nuisance of yourself. So there is certainly an incentive to go along, to get to your next position. You want to have a reputation as someone who's easy to work with, isn't going to push the wrong buttons, because otherwise you're just not going to advance in your career. And I do think this is something that unfortunately can have a very pernicious effect because people know that in order to achieve greater levels of power, which in their mind, they think like, oh, if I have more power, then I can influence the policy. But in order to get that power, you have to be willing to not shake up that policy too much. I don't know if.
No, I think that's correct. I mean, the State Department is a hierarchical work culture, institutional culture, and people are focused. They have these issues that they deeply care about, but they're also focused on their careers and on trying to build those careers. The Foreign Service, which is what I served in, is very much an upper-out system, and as Annelle says, if you make a nuisance of yourself, you're not moving up very as fast as you would, if you're doing things that are perceived as useful and beneficial for the policy work of the department. There are ways you can be a dissent voice that are perceived as useful in the department sometimes, maybe with a certain amount of time, and it won't hurt you. But there are risks involved in doing it in a system that's hierarchical and upper out.
Yeah. Kind of a two-part question, different questions for both of you, same topic. Ambassador Roebuck, do you wish you had resigned or resigned publicly after you sent out that memo? And for Dr. Sheline, do you wish you hadn't resigned? Do you regret making that choice and wish you had worked more internally to try and advocate for change?
Good question. I do not regret not resigning. I think when I sent in the memo, a lot of the damage had been done. The Turks had already invaded. They had already set up this occupation. But it's a good question, and I wouldn't dismiss it as something that's not important. It was something I thought about. I just felt, as I mentioned earlier, I was more motivated to try to stay and work to improve that relationship with the Kurds and to repair the damage that had been done. While the situation was abusive and there were some significant human rights situations that had gone on, it was nothing compared to what had taken place in Gaza. Nothing. I mean, just not the same scale of human rights carnage.
Yeah, no, if I were to do it again, I would. And although, I wasn't expecting policy to change significantly as a result of my resignation. Again, I really didn't think it was going to get much attention at all. But I think it's been a little disappointing to have then seen subsequent resignations and to continue to not see any sort of shift. And so I think the reason that I don't question it at all is because it's in conversation with people, especially in or from the region, who express how much they appreciate seeing that there is internal dissent, that people are speaking out and doing so, to the detriment of their own careers, again, especially some of the other people I mentioned. And I think that is significant, that I think if they're already, especially, so I just got back from a trip to Jordan, their, American credibility is shredded, that some Jordanians are worried that Israel might be about to invade them next. I don't think that would necessarily happen, but there's been no repercussions for Israel invading Lebanon, so I'm not that surprised that Jordanians are asking this question. And hearing from people who say how much it meant to them to know that people were speaking out against this. Mostly the question I got was like, were you afraid? Because these are people living in societies where they would need to be afraid for having spoken out against their government. And I do feel extremely fortunate to still live in a society where that is not yet the case. I do wonder a little bit the outcome of the coming election, whether that is still going to be true. I think it's something that unfortunately this university has not done a good job handling protests against what's happening in Gaza. I'm dismayed by the GW administration's approach to this. I think that we are, especially if we do see a Trump administration, we may see some pretty scary crackdowns on dissent, on expressions of public opposition to policy. And I think it is something that will require all of us who value, what this country is supposed to stand for. We're all going to need to pull together and try to push back against attacks on our fundamental freedoms.
One last question, maybe?
You kind of touched on it before, but I just wanted to know, where do you think the conflict will lead in the Middle East based on the presidential candidates?
The presidential candidates.
I mean, each candidate has different, I'll focus on the Middle East, which is the area I focus on, the area I know the best. Each candidate has different accents on how they would handle things. I think in the Middle East, there's some division about who they would support more. In the election in 2016, for example, in the Arab Gulf, there was a lot of support for then candidate Trump, and they were quite happy when he won the election. After him being in office for 4 years and them sort of having a chance to really assess his policies and his leadership, I think maybe there's a little more skepticism, but I've heard from people that there's still a lot of latent support for him and for the policies that he brings to bear and on the Middle East. Vice President Harris is more of a newcomer to foreign policy. Obviously, she was in the administration, but she is, she didn't have the kind of foreign policy background Biden had when he became vice president. So it's a little less clear what her instincts are going to be. But what I've seen and read so far and looked at some of her advisors like Phil Gordon, Nancy before him, Nancy McEldowney. These are people with very fine foreign policy credentials, and I think they have a lot of respect for her. So we'll see how it plays out. There's some slight, I would say, some some different accents in how they'll handle foreign policy. The bigger differences, I think, will be domestic.
Yeah, I mean, I've had people say to me, you know, well, if Trump wins, I mean, at least it can't get any worse. And I think the argument would be, no, it certainly could get worse. As far as, although I don't see this administration really having used any of America's significant leverage to try to rein in Israeli behavior. We could see the total annexation of the West Bank, the expulsion of Palestinians into Jordan or elsewhere. You know, there is a small amount of humanitarian aid getting in. We could see that be completely cut off. I think especially this question of if US ends up getting dragged into war with Iran, I would be extremely concerned to have Trump be commander-in-chief under those circumstances. So I'm fairly concerned that, you know, of what another Trump administration would do to US policy and US credibility in the Middle East and around the world. On Vice President Harris, I think that as Ambassador Roebuck mentioned, she has some good people on her team who I think have expressed some skepticism towards kind of an overly militarized US approach to the Middle East, which I very much agree with. I would hope that her background as a lawyer and a prosecutor would encourage her to uphold American laws, but I'm not holding my breath for that. I mean, my fear is that, you know, we may be on the precipice of a wider war, you know, with the deployment of 100 US troops to Israel. Technically, that should prompt the War Powers Act. The president needs to notify Congress. It has been notified, but Congress now has 60 days to either authorize a war or those troops need to come home under the War Powers Act. And I think that the concern may be that the Biden administration is anticipating that they will be fired upon by Iran, and then the US will in fact get into war with Iran, which could potentially drag in Russia and China. So, you know, and I don't know that either candidate is really in a good position to handle a situation like that, where events could really quickly spiral out of control.
I'll invite you to come back in 4 weeks when we talk about it with maybe a little more clarity on the election results, but maybe not.
Yeah, there is one other.
Okay, so we'll go to one last question online now.
What advice would you give to a mid-level officer that is trying to find the quote happy medium between dissent and staying in the State Department? Can you be seen as useful or constructive and still hold true to your values without pissing people off?
It's a very good question. I think it's part of the tension in being a young diplomat or a mid-level diplomat, as this person describes themselves. And those tensions are never going to go away. I think in the professional world and in foreign policy, you are dealing with human issues. You're dealing with really fraught issues sometimes where lives are at stake, where political stability can be at stake. And you are going to feel implicated sometimes in the decisions that you make or that you have to uphold and implement. And you have to, you know, do a balancing act. You know, is the situation so terrible? Is the policy so terrible? The consequences so reprehensible that you just can't stomach it anymore? Then I think you have to look to get out and to find an honorable way to get out that will hopefully have some sort of impact. And this is where dissent can come in to help you formulate an exit like that. If the threshold is lower than that, the situation that bothers you, you feel implicated, but you know, maybe you feel like you can also do some good, or that you don't feel like you can have any impact in any case, maybe you'll make a different decision. And it depends, again, on the threshold of how bad the situation is and how much you feel personally implicated and troubled by it as to how you should respond.
Yeah, this came up in the lunch we had with some students ahead of time. And as we said then, it's very personal. I think it really does boil down to how you feel walking through the door each day. And I do think that many people come to Washington because they want to make a difference, or they're working in these roles because they believe in the power of what the US government can accomplish abroad or at home. And so I think people do just really need to be honest with themselves about to what extent is their continued participation kind of in keeping with the reasons they maybe got involved in the first place. Because I do think, as we talked about, there are a lot of incentives for just kind of keeping your head down and putting in the work and trying to work your way up the ladder, which I think requires, to a certain extent, people to sort of let go of maybe the reasons that they joined in the first place to try and make a difference, or that they believed that that their personal participation could have an impact. But I do think there's also very much something to be said for being able to be on the inside, to work your way up, to be in a role where when you do express dissent or whatever, or you're in a role where you can make the policy, those things do matter. And having people on the inside who are committed has a real impact. And like I said, given who wins the election, we may be really, really hoping to have people on the inside who are committed to, the values that as Americans we say we stand for and try to uphold.
I'd like to just add too, we've been talking about two specific cases of really war and peace, and very, very much high policy questions. But to get to the question from the online mid-level officer, there are, especially if you're a mid-level officer, you're dealing with plenty of lower threshold policy questions. So it doesn't become so much a question of dissent as much as shaping the discussion, maybe shaping the outcome. If you're serving with good leadership, the good leaders will be open to other views because they realize that's the best way to come to a good policy outcome. If you're serving under bad leaders, and certainly none of the three of us ever did at the State Department, but just theoretically, then it becomes more frustrating. You get a worse policy outcome, and the question that should I stay or go becomes probably a lot easier to answer. Anyway, on that note, I will thank all of you for your attention, and I will particularly thank our two guests for both what they've done in their careers, what they are continuing to do in their careers, and for sharing some of that with all of us today. So please join me in a well-earned round of applause.